All right, welcome to I'm just going to do some modeling of how to do semiotic analysis, and I'm going to connect to the chapters that we're reading, and then I'll add maybe some more analysis each time. So, what I'm going to do is do a little bit of semiotic analysis of Joy Harjo's Living Nations, Living Words poet laureate project that she made 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I can't quite remember. So let me kind of pull up um, some of the questions that I kind of raised and go over how to kind of begin. So once you find your kind of a multimedia text, I really highly recommend finding one that's robust, gives you a lot of things to look at and analyze, and I would probably try to tie it to education as well. So let's take a look at Joy Harjo's Living Nations, Living Words, a map of First Peoples poetry. And I'm just going to quickly go through here. Here is her kind of exposition on introducing the map. And then the layout will lead to a map of different First Nations poets, and we'll get thoroughly. I just wanted to show a little bit about what this map does. Kind of the initial questions that you want to think about: whose interest and agency is at work here in the meaning making? So, Joy Harjo, she's a poet laureate. She's an Indigenous poet. She's 2 times the poet laureate of the United States, and poet laureates work on projects. And so her interest is to map Indigenous poets from North America, and so that's her interest, to map and locate and also give voice to the poets as well. So kind of like framing around an ontological question of we are still here, and it's Joy Harjo's agency in making of the meaning. So she, as a poet but also as an Indigenous poet, she has a political purpose for naming and foregrounding Indigenous cultures, Indigenous ways of being, and kind of in placing the importance of that they are still here, and that they are still relevant, and they are still making meanings with the world. So the meaning what is the meaning being made here? So again, this is a ArcGIS StoryMap is kind of the software, which is a mapping software that you can use to kind of embed narrative, image, video, audio onto a digital map. And so the meanings here is to be able to map poetry, poets into mapping onto place. So it's really kind of tying the poetry to place, because the genre of mapping is an ontological one that states what I draw on a map, this exists, this is here. So that is kind of the meaning. And so with what resources is Joy Harjo creating the social world? It's through the Library of Congress. So this is federally funded and federally granted. And the resources are the ArcGIS resources, which are multi-layer maps, being able to create and embed text and image and video, as well as audio. And so those are the resources that are available. So there are a lot of kind of meaning making resources with ArcGIS, and she is using this, I think, depthly. So, and the meaning potentials are really important because she's tying the Indigenous poets to the mapping. Is she's placing them back into place. And so the meaning potentials of map making is she's creating an image where the existence of these poets is ontological, meaning that they are here. This is them. And then the indicators of power relationship is her. She has kind of the privilege of being a poet laureate. But it's interesting when you read this. So I'm going to read this. The very first maps were drawn into the earth with sticks or stone implements. They told us where we lived, the location of food, water, and danger. Some were star maps of heavens, histories notched and painted, or symbols of stories that gave direction on how to live. So Joy Harjo is using writing to explain kind of the ontological purpose of maps from the earliest days. And then some of the earliest indigenous maps of North America were not drawn. The placement and orientation of a village, its buildings, and even mountain structures were markers that mirrored the meaning of the heavens or other directional senses. So we mapped with weaving, baskets, and in songs. So what she's saying is, in indigenous cultures, the mode of map making was through the art. So she's actually this is transduction. She's taking kind of indigenous mapping techniques of weaving and basket making and storytelling and in songs and in poems onto the technology of mapping, like how GPS is mapped. So we still do. So we mapped in weavings and songs. We carry many kinds of maps in our poems. We still do, even as we rely on maps with the newest technologies. So now she's like making this transductive argument of like kind of these early technologies of mapping in indigenous cultures to the new digital age. And then now she's explaining for my signature project, as a 23rd Poet Laureate consultant in poetry, I conceived the idea of mapping the U.S. with Native nations, poets, and poems. I want this map to counter damaging false assumptions. So this is her political agency, and this is her as the rhetoriker. One of her political purposes that indigenous peoples of our country are often invisible or not seen as human. So this is kind of the political purpose that she's making this map. You will not find us fairly represented, if at all, in the cultural storytelling of America, and nearly non-existent in the American Book of Poetry. So cultural storytelling, and in the book American poetry, the canon, First Nations, indigenous authors have kind of been erased. So there's an ontological, they don't exist. And so her map making is providing an ontological purpose of, yes, these storytellers and poets do exist, we exist, and we exist now. Like other living American poets, Native Nation poets use the tools of knowledge and creativity to ride the waves of language, even as we also tend to our indigenous cultural systems and communities. Our common language of English, or sometimes Spanish, is a crossing place, a place to meet many from all over the world, and like any other group of humans, we travel for economic opportunities, for education, for love, and for adventure. Though we may venture far from our origin story, we are bound by genealogy, by land, and even by instinct. So this is kind of this is the text-heavy part, which kind of anchors the map, and so, but also explains and names what this is. And so she is using the affordances of text or writing to really kind of do that exposition that you can't quite do in just image alone. So when we start thinking about modes, we gotta, what modes are in play? And so we got text and image are kind of the primary modes right now that are in play, and the affordances of speech and writing, or writing in general, is to name, explain, and anchor, and uses anchoring to an image, like Roland Barthes, when he talks about photographs and text anchoring an image, captions usually serve as that kind of anchor to explain what this image gives, the kind of the rationale why this image is located within the text. So it provides an anchor and explanation of connecting the text to the image. And so these are the affordances, and then the image depicts. So this is a really interesting, the introductory map, because there is some rhetoric going on in the map making. So if you look closely at the map, it's a political map, meaning boundaries are more driven by politics rather than kind of other features. So if you look at some of the lines, you can see some of the political lines drawn of states, of the United States, and even the international boundaries of Mexico and Canada are there as well. But they're kind of subtle. They're kind of more in the background. And what Joy Harjo and the map maker is doing here is in placing and foregrounding with color maps of indigenous nations. So the Muskegon Nation down here, the Caddoan, the Thapskin nations here, and then here you would probably get the Haudenosaunee Confederacy nations that are here in like New York State and Canada, but it's being kind of blocked out by the black title screen. So this is really kind of an interesting thing. So, but also layout also organizes aspects of ontological status. So the layout and design is giving an ontological status of the representation. So she's ontologically overlaying indigenous nations above kind of the current like political nation state maps that currently define each different state or Canada, United States, and Mexico. It's also a way that kind of orientates us as a social group or not. So this is a scroll down map. So it provides an orientation with the text, and then it kind of, if you see how it just overlays the original map, and then we move into more of just a geographical map. So this is not a political map. This is more of a geographical map that kind of shows geography. And this is a really interesting move. But then if you notice, she's using text squares as you scroll down to kind of like anchor the map. So in this map, you can begin anywhere. So this is kind of the affordances of layout, and actually the viewer has a position by interest. And so you can begin anywhere on this map and start clicking on different it's really cool. They're like little suns. So icons, using icons, but then you click, and I clicked around here because we're in New York. So Alex Jacobs, he's a member of the St. Regis Mohawk Indian Nation, New York. And then there's a description: Alex Jacobs is a Mohawk visual artist, spoken word poet, and freelance writer based on the St. Regis Mohawk territory on the border between New York and Canada. He has also lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 27 years and travels there to work on art and poetry project to attend Indian art markets. So again, this is kind of the naming aspect of the affordances of text. You can't get this by just looking at his image, and so image alone can't really convey this information. So it needs to be the affordances of writing really work well in kind of giving the background. All right, so let's talk about kind of what modes are being used to fix meaning. So modal fixing provides the material from text ontology that can be shaped being framings of different kinds. So the frame of genre being as one. So we are in a genre. This is a multi-genre. This is one mapping. So the primary genre is mapping, but it's a digital map. So it has the affordances of embedding text and linking and hyperlinking, which is really interesting. So hyperlinking, if you look at the listen to poem and commentary, if I click on this, it'll take me to his page. And if you click here,
Trudell. I wrote this poem for
you
John
get an
Trudell
audio recording
after
of
watching
the poet
Heather Ray documentary. And when Native people hear the name
reading his
Trudell,
poetry. So that's a really interesting use of the affordances of digital media because it hyperlinks. Now with poetry, so this is really great kind of fixing poetry onto map making. So the modal fixing is really interesting because the genre of poetry is then getting fixed onto a map which indicates place. So it's really tying the art of poetry with land and place, which is really important in indigenous cultures. Is why it's kind of cool. But also, what's important with poetry, and poetry usually is an oral form of performance. So poetry typically, unless it's like concrete poetry, should be heard. It should be listened to. You should be able to hear the rhythm and the song and the lyrical nature of poetry. So that is why she's doing Harjo is doing the hyperlinking to the poet. So that's kind of a modal fixing of kind of crossing genres of poetry, mapping onto the physical rhetorics of map, of placing and placement, which is, again, then can be traced back to the political purpose of Joy Harjo is unveiling or revealing kind of marginalized peoples and then placing them on the map and pretty much putting them into existence, at least for non-indigenous readers and viewers, staking claim that these people are still here. All right, so let's think about the designer rhetoric. What is the world about? How is it organized as knowledge? So this is the title, Living Nations and Living Words. So she is creating a social world or a text around kind of the idea of indigenous cultures being living and have living words, and also in tying it to kind of the worldview of indigenous nations is their kind of really connection with land. And so that's why mapping is kind of a really important rhetorical strategy. And so it's organized through the discourse of mapping. Who is involved as the participants in the world and in what ways? So Joy Harjo is kind of the designer rhetoric, but it's also the indigenous poets that have kind of linked to, agreed to be mapped onto this, and they've provided their poetry. So these are the poets, and they're being involved, and this text is providing voice and to some, and naming of where they are in their place, but also their poetry and the importance of their poetry to themselves, but also importance to poetry as American culture as well, or poetry in the English language arts or language arts or world languages. What are the relationships between participants in this world? So the relationships between them they're all poets that are distinctly indigenous poets, but also tied to their place. So the relationships are through their storytellers, but also the relationships with indigenous sovereignty, indigenous identity, indigenous culture. We can then think about mode. So how is this world represented, and how does the designer most aptly represent the things? So for a project that wants to do mapping or emplacing an ontological thing of poetry is here, mapping is actually really I think the most apt way to do this is using mapping, because maps do make an ontological statement that this thing exists out there in the real world. So that's an ontological statement. And then placing poetry onto that is really cool. So I think it's unique and creative in that typically you wouldn't think of poetry as being mapped or using mapping to map poetry, but I really think this is kind of just a really wonderfully creative and I would say artistic kind of way to represent or remediate poetry. We can think about what the political and social purposes of the intended text. I've already kind of mentioned that, but her political purposes are kind of the relocating or revealing of indigenous cultures, indigenous poetry back onto the landscape of Americana. So that these cultures and poets and stories have been kind of erased through 600 years of colonization, ethnic cleansing, and oppression. And now her political purpose is to form a resistance, but show resilience, but also to foreground that we are still here and our poets still live and exist, and their wonderful words, if you want to listen to them, are available on this map. All right, so another rhetorical thing is what ways does the political and communicational effect provoke and produce the rearrangement of social relations by semiotic means? So this political purpose provokes the arrangement of social relations by semiotic means by doing kind of the digital tech clicking of using icons to be placed onto mapping, and icons representing each indigenous author. Here's another one, Henry Reelbird. From Gary Owen, Montana. You get an image of the author, so you get to see who this author is. That's another use of image. The image makes a claim that this is the person, so kind of a real kind of direction to reality. And the the semiotic means then are using icons to emplace real people, real poets onto the map. And so that is kind of the rhetoric being used, is kind of using the semiotics of digital design, iconography, hyperlinking with this digital ArcGIS story mapping software to really kind of reconnect or reestablish social relationships among indigenous authors and nations and poets, but also with ourselves, with connecting to these indigenous authors, nations, and poets. So it's kind of a really interesting rhetorical move. How does the designer transform the political intent into semiotic form? So this is more kind of like that political rhetoric purpose, and then using the design of map making, using icons, pinning. So if you ever use ArcGIS story maps, these are different types of pinning that then you can add image and caption to, and hyperlink to video or audio. You can also embed video as well in story mapping. So that is the way that you can transform the rhetorical political purpose into the semiotic purposes and to make a multimodal thing in design. And so this is really efficient design because you can, and it's based off of the viewer's interest. So if I'm interested in here, or maybe I want Hawaii, I can click here. So it's more interactive with the viewer, has a lot of agency in the design, and meaning you get to choose where you want to go on the map. Translation, how does meaning shift across genres, modes, and cultures? So the meaning of poetry, poetry is being translated into more digital forms. So again, poetry being linked to audio, which is more the traditional way, but generally when we read it in text form. So she's actually kind of skipping the textual form of the poet, although you can get the poet here, to more the audio. So she's returning orality to poetry onto a digital format, which is kind of a really cool translation. So the poetry doesn't change meaning, it's just shifting across different modes and different modes, speech to writing to digital form. And then transduction, in what ways does meaning material shift from one mode to another? So I think the biggest I would say the really interesting aspect of the transduction is kind of how the meaning of the meaning making aspect of poetry is then shifted into a map mode, which actually transforms the meaning of just this poet existing here in this singular poetry, but it now is embedded into a place on the world in a specific location and geography in a specific indigenous nation. And so the transduction is really kind of creating this more over a worldview of kind of indigenous nations, indigenous resilience, and indigenous sovereignty, I think, is kind of being placed in and actually transforming or transducing just the spoken or written text of poetry onto a visual format that says this exists here and in this location. So I think that is one of the most, I think transduction is really an interesting aspect. So this is kind of how we're going to do semiotic analysis. I will probably come back and do some more with chapters 7 and 8 that we're reading next week to add on, and then I will have kind of the guide with all these guiding questions to help you do your own semiotic analysis. Hopefully this is helpful, and I will see you in the discussion threads.